Hey, fourth graders, I'm back. Mrs. O'Donnell, I'm going to read 2 chapters of A Bear Named Trouble. We just finished chapter 8. I'm now going to read chapter 9 and 10. Chapter 9, Take Care of Trouble. Trouble? You name that bear Trouble? Disobeying one more order, Jonathan had slept on the living room couch while his father was gone, and he sat up now, bleary-eyed but nonetheless awake. Yes, his father replied. Do you have a better suggestion? Jonathan didn't even have to pause to consider. Killer, he said. You should call him Killer, that's what he is. His father sighed. He's a bear, Johnny. He did what bears do. It's what I've been trying to tell you. Jonathan shook his head, trying to clear away the image of Mama Goose, dead and limp and so soft in his arms. He said, I thought bears killed to eat. He didn't want her for food. He barely stopped long enough to smell her. He just knocked her dead and went on his way. His dad sighed again. Jonathan could tell he was growing exasperated. What do you want me to do? Capture him. Take him away. Take him so far away he can never come back again, Jonathan cried. He's dangerous. You can't let him stay here. His father looked surprised. He also looked enormously tired. Well, we're going to have to catch him first before we can do anything. But zoos aren't in the business of transporting animals. Besides, but he didn't say any more. He's a murderer, Jonathan said. He's got to be taken away. His father shook his head. I think we're mighty lucky that Mama Goose was the only fatality last night. What were you thinking of anyway? Luring a bear to our deck with food and then following him through the night. I stayed back, out of the way. Dad snorted, a tiny puff of exasperated breath. Do you have any idea how fast that brownie could run if he decided that he didn't want you following him and he came at you? 30 miles an hour, I guess. Jonathan had read it somewhere, maybe more. Yeah, his dad replied. And do you think you can run 30 miles an hour, maybe more? Jonathan shrugged. When his father drew his eyebrows together in irritation, he said, No, I don't suppose I can. Johnny. His dad came over and sat down on the couch beside him. How many times do I have to tell you? Bears are wild animals, even the ones in the zoo, like Jake. He's been around humans since he was a baby. And do you know how far I'd trust him if I had to go into his cage when he was in there? Jonathan started to shrug again to show that he didn't know, didn't care, but then he stopped. There was no point in annoying his father further. Not very far, he said. You're darned right. No farther than I could throw the big brute if he came at me. Jonathan nodded. Anyway, he said, trying to sound reasonable so his father would listen, Mama Goose wasn't doing anything to him, just making a lot of noise the way she always does. All he wanted to do was just shut her up. And Jonathan swung one hand as though it was a big paw, and he found that he could speak no further. His throat had tightened up. I know, son, I know. His dad put an arm around his shoulders. And I'm really sorry it happened. I know you loved that old goose. That didn't begin to describe it. But all Jonathan said was, well, Rhonda loved her too. I told Rhonda all about her, and you know how she loves birds. She thought Mama Goose was even better than the seagulls we used to watch over Lake Superior back in Minnesota. Yeah, Dad agreed. I'm sure Rhonda loved her too, just hearing about her from you. But there you are. She's gone now. Actually, I think your she may have been a he. Mama Goose, a boy? Jonathan almost laughed, but then he began to cry instead. Big sobs that seemed to rise from the soles of his feet. He didn't think he'd tell his sister that part. Too confusing. But he did know what he'd say to her. But he didn't know what he'd say to her on the phone now. Mama Goose was mostly what they'd talked about since he'd gotten to Alaska. His father said something more. He just pulled Jonathan closer. I've got an idea, he said, stroking the hair back from Jonathan's face. I think this is a good day for you to stay home from school. I'll bet even your mama would agree if she were here to see you now. Jonathan sniffed. wiped his nose on his pajama sleeve, and half laughed. Being a teacher, his mother found very few excuses good enough for staying home from school. Fever, vomiting, or something major broken. That was about it. Would she understand about Mama Goose? What'll I do all day? He asked, although already he knew one thing he wanted to do if he was left alone in the house. I don't know, his dad replied. Read, watch a bit of TV, maybe write a letter to one of your friends. How does that sound? Okay, Jonathan said. And then in case he hadn't sounded enthusiastic enough and his dad might change his mind, he sat up straight and said, Good. Dad stood and pulled Jonathan gently to his feet. Why don't you start with a shower, maybe followed by another nap? You must have missed a lot of sleep last night. Jonathan nodded and he headed for the stairs. He'd start with the shower, no problem, but he wasn't the least bit interested in a nap. In fact, a plan was developing for when his dad left to go back to the zoo. He was going to call one of the local TV stations and tell them all about Trouble. If they reported that a wild bear had killed Mama Goose, someone would have to do something about him for sure. Jonathan stood in the shower a long time, letting the hot water slam into his head, his face. He stayed so long, in fact, and he dressed so slowly that Dad had already eaten his oatmeal and gone back to the zoo by the time he came downstairs. So he fixed himself some Cheerios, even put his muddy jacket and the PJs he'd been wearing into the washing machine. And then he got the phone book out and looked up a number. The ring at the other end seemed to buzz inside his head. He waited. KTUU, Channel 2, said a woman's voice. Jonathan's mouth went suddenly dry. He'd never talked to anyone from a television station before. Why hadn't he figured out what he was going to say before he dialed the phone? KTTU, Channel 2, the woman said again, a little impatiently this time it seemed. And so he blurted it out, the thing they needed to know. I've got some news for you. It's something you're going to want to do a story on. There's a killer on the loose in Anchorage. So now we're switching over to the italicized font, which means we're moving to the point of view of the bear. For a while, Trouble kept moving away from the zoo. The trees in his residential area of the city were heavy. Keeping hidden from the humans who were beginning to emerge was not that difficult. And if there were other bears anywhere around to challenge him for the bits of food he occasionally found, he didn't encounter them. After a time, though, he turned and retraced his steps until he was back at the outer zoo fence again. He prowled along it for a short distance until he came to a dip in the ground beneath some fir trees. He curled up in that inviting gloom of the trees, tucking his aching muzzle beneath a paw, and waited. Just waited. When it grew dark, he would go in search of food again, and maybe, at last, he would find a way to reach that other bear behind the fence. Chapter 10. Good. And not only did the wild bear named Trouble by one of the keepers break into the zoo, while he was inside, he killed Mama Goose, a snow-white goose that was a favorite of visiting children. The newscaster reporting the story stood in front of Jake's bear enclosure, but Jake, apparently not interested in the publicity, was nowhere in sight. Jonathan sat on the couch next to his father, watching the news program, but out of the corner of his eye, he was really watching his father. His dad shook his head. I sure would like to know who told them, he said. When they showed up at the zoo, there wasn't much we could do but let the reporters in. They already knew the whole story. Jonathan felt a little bit of guilt, but just a flicker. Some things just had to be told. His father should understand that. He'd had a hard time at first, convincing the man the receptionist had turned him over to, not the reporter giving the story now, but some kind of editor, that the story he was telling on the phone was real. Only when Jonathan had finally told him that his dad was one of the zookeepers had the man started to listen. Now, the camera on the story was showing footprints in the layer of fresh snow along Jake's fence. There were bare footprints on both sides of the fence, but Jonathan was through listening. He'd gotten what he wanted. The world now knew that a wild bear had broken into the zoo and killed Mama Goose, a favorite of visiting children. The phone rang and his dad got up wearily to answer it. Jonathan leaned back into the couch, paying no attention to the conversation. It wouldn't be his mom, because she and his dad had talked a long time last night, so she probably wouldn't be calling again tonight. Oh, what was he going to tell his sister when he talked to her next time? Some of the stories he'd told her about Mama Goose might have been a bit exaggerated. He would admit that. Like when he told her that Mama Goose came running to meet him every time he came to the zoo. But he told her true things too. Like about the way Mama Goose would honk back when you honked at her. Rhonda was really excited about meeting her very own goose. Well, that's it, Dad said, hanging up the phone and returning to the couch. What's it? Jonathan asked. That was Pat Rawlings, the curator. Somebody called him from the Fish and Game department. Yeah, Jonathan said, not really interested. Well, the news program had moved on, but they were still talking about bears. This segment was about how important it was for homeowners not to attract bears by leaving garbage cans out or having bird feeders that could be reached by bears. Or loaves of bread on their desks, Jonathan thought to himself. Oop, decks, not desks. The newscaster was saying that about 250 black bears lived in the Anchorage area and about 60 brown bears. When they lose their fear of humans because they associate us with food, they can become extremely dangerous. One of the rangers heard the news report about trouble, his dad had said. Now Jonathan sat up straighter, turning his full attention to his father for the first time. The next time that brown bear breaks into the zoo, the folks over at Fish and Game want to be alerted. Why? Jonathan asked, although he knew, of course. Well, when Trouble leaves the zoo, they're going to take care of him. Take care of Trouble, Jonathan repeated. What does that mean? Well, they're going to put him down, his father said in a flat voice, not looking in Jonathan's direction. Put him down. For an instant, Jonathan felt as though he'd been kicked in the gut. Put Trouble down? Off him? Kill him? So Trouble would end up dead? As limp and useless as Mama Goose? Well, why can't they just take him away? Someplace so far that he can never come back here? Well, the rules of this state, there's a firm policy, his father said. Once a bear loses his fear of people, he's going to get into trouble wherever he goes. He's too dangerous to be allowed to live anywhere. Bears like that have to be destroyed. Jonathan's head spun. For a moment, he thought he might be ill, but then he drew himself up and took a deep, wavering breath. Good, he said. He said it as though he meant it, too. After all, wouldn't Trouble just be getting what he deserved? Wouldn't he? Okay, now we're back to Trouble's point of view. Trouble stood outside the fence to Jake's enclosure and moaned softly. The older bear, apparently having tired of these nightly encounters, just didn't respond. He didn't even come out from his den this time. Trouble would have dug under his fence too, but unlike the outer perimeter fences at the zoo that were meant only to keep humans out, the fences enclosing the animals in the zoo were set in concrete. Finally, the young bear Trouble just sat, and then after another long period of waiting, he curled into a ball right there, tight against the fence that kept him separated from Jake. He was miserable. He wasn't finding enough food, and his stomach roared at him. His broken jaw had never quit pounding from the instant the moose had kicked him. But most fiercely of all, he still missed his mother. More than he wanted the pain to go away. More than he wanted food to fill his empty belly. He was still a very young bear, and he wanted his mother.